Just a quick introduction. My name is Devin Knight. If you're not familiar with me, I'm the training director at Pragmatic Works, so I do anything that has to do with training, including webinars. I work very closely with Rachel on. I'm a SQL Server MVP, so I've had that since about just October, so under a year I've been an MVP. I've authored, actually, it's about to be 6 SQL Server books, so I have a new SSIS book coming out, all mainly around SQL Server. I also run a local user group here in Jacksonville called the Jacksonville SQL Server User Group. And I also blog at a website called bidn.com where I take a lot of pictures of internet cats, as you can see there. So our plan for today, what we're going to be looking at is, first of all, we're going to talk about what Power BI is and what really all the entities are that make up Power BI, because there's a lot of different pieces and parts of Power BI. So we're going to talk about all of what those pieces and parts are and how they fit together. And then we're also going to get a quick little tour of all the tools. There's a lot of tools that I plan on showing you today. So a lot of what I'm going to show you will probably be partially completed or maybe all the way completed, just so that I can make sure I have time to show you a little glimpse at what everything is that's available to you. Then briefly at the end, I'm going to bring up and talk about what the Power BI pricing is. They actually released the pricing for Power BI about a month ago, maybe a little bit more than a month ago. So that way, if you're interested in actually subscribing to Power BI, you'll have some kind of an idea of what cost it would be for you. So we'll talk a bit about that. All right, so let's start by talking first about what is Power BI. And Power BI really is an accumulation of a bunch of different tools that allow your business to do self-service BI. Okay, so you'll see a lot of people talk about self-service BI and Power BI together, and that's because Power BI is Microsoft's flavor of their way of doing self-service BI. It's mainly through Excel, and it's an accumulation of a bunch of tools. Some of them you may be already familiar with, and some of them may be brand new to you. So what comes with Power BI is a set of tools, and I'm going to kind of talk about each of those tools here. The first tool I'm going to bring up with you, and I'll demo to you here in a few moments, is Power Query. Power Query is a self-service data extraction tool. Okay, so those of you that are more familiar with the enterprise way of doing BI, this would be more along the lines of an SSIS type of a tool. It's certainly not as enterprise ready as SSIS is, but it allows you to do all kinds of data extractions and manipulations, so it has a transform layer in there, all through a familiar interface, all through Excel. Now the beautiful thing about Power Query is even though it's a brand new tool, Microsoft actually created it in a way that it can be used both in Excel 2010 or 2013. Either one will work just fine. So if you have either Excel 2010 or 2013, you can use Power Query and start extracting data and pulling it into Excel. Now, what the point of that is it's going to allow you to pull in some new data sources and eventually add that information to a data source that you already have. So picture this. I have a data warehouse, or I have some kind of a reporting database that I use right now. But I'd like to enhance that reporting database by adding some new and more interesting data sources. Now, if I were to ask IT to do that, it would oftentimes take them months to complete. It may take them even up to 6 months or a year to complete adding in a new data source into my reporting database. So what Power Query allows me to do is pull in that new interesting data source that I would like to add in for reporting purposes and merge it together with my reporting database all through Excel. So I take in my new interesting data set through Power Query, I merge that together using a tool called PowerPivot, which is my next one I'll talk about here. So merging my Power Query extract and my data model that I have for my reporting layer, I can bring those two together inside PowerPivot. Okay, so Power Query is the data extraction tool. PowerPivot is more of a data mashup tool. So it can allow you to take multiple data sources, multiple extraneous data sources together, pull them together, and create relationships between them. So I can create relationships between data sources that didn't previously have relationships. Okay, so I can even find data out on the web, for example, using Power Query, and merge that together or mash that data up together with my data warehouse, and I can do that through PowerPivot. So Power Query, data extraction tool, PowerPivot, data modeling tool. Okay, so if you're in the enterprise BI world, this would kind of translate to your integration services tool, okay, SSIS. Whereas PowerPivot is very similar to your data modeling tool or analysis services. Both of these are your self-service ways of doing SSIS and SSAS. The next tool here that we're going to talk about, again, PowerPivot being that data mashup tool and relationship tool, The next tool we're going to look at is PowerView. PowerView is a data visualization tool that allows you to pull in the data that you placed in PowerPivot and then create visualizations on top of it. The great thing about PowerView is it takes the relationships that you created in PowerPivot and enables your users to interact with the data in a way that actually follows the relationships that you've created. Now you'll see some examples of this later, but basically what I'm trying to describe to you here is that you can have report items talk to each other without you having to do any extra configuration because it's all based on the relationships in your PowerPivot model. So based on those relationships, I can select a bar chart or a bar inside of a bar chart, and it'll actually filter another report item based on relationships I have. And PowerView is a very interactive reporting tool. It's done quite often for ad hoc reporting. Okay. Power Map, next tool that we have in our Power BI tools. A lot of power words here, of course. I already have 4 power words, and I got more to go. Power Map is a mapping visualization tool, as you may guess, and it's built into Excel 2013 only. Now, I should mention this. I forgot to mention this after the first one here. For your Power Query, I mentioned that that one can be used both in Excel 2010 and 2013. Okay, both. PowerPivot is also available in 2010 Excel and 2013. PowerView, if you're going the Excel path, is 2013 only. There is a way you can do it with SharePoint 2010, however. And then Power Map is also only Excel 2013. So just keep that in mind. There are some limitations to certain things that you're doing when it comes to these different tools. All right. Okay, so Power Map being another visualization tool, but it's specific to geographical data and allows you to place that geographical data on a 3D map. Okay. All right, now let's keep going. Power BI Sites. This is another component of Power BI. This is basically like SharePoint Online. So it's a component of Office 365. You have to have Office 365 to do it. And it's a Power BI site that you use for deploying these reports off to your site. So basically, once I create these nice PowerPivot models, I create PowerView reports on it, I need some way to share this with others because right now at this point it just lives in Excel. But I want to make sure that I can share it with others, so I would deploy it to a Power BI site. And from the Power BI site, it's going to allow me to do things like data refreshes, so I can schedule my data in my reports to get automatically refreshed. And it's also going to allow me to do things like this new feature here called Power BI Q&A. Okay? So Power BI Sites is a web page that you go and you deploy your reports off to and your models to. Power BI Q&A is within inside of a Power BI site. Now what Q&A allows you to do, this is probably one of the really neat new features that's available in Power BI. What this basically allows you to do is deploy out a PowerPivot workbook that you've developed, deploy that to the Power BI site, and then you can ask English questions, just like regular English questions like you would be talking to a person, you can ask that of your data. So I can ask English questions of my data, it will return back results, and it usually returns back those results in a PowerView report. And it also determines on how to visualize that data. So if I ask it for geographical data, it'll automatically put it in a map for me. If I ask for trending data, it'll usually try and put that into a line chart for me. So it usually tries to make the best decision for visualizing that data based on what you asked it. So Q&A is another one I'm going to show you, but it's a very interesting new tool that allows you to literally just ask English questions. They call it the natural query language that you query against your data set, and it visualizes that data based on the type of data you're looking at. Okay. All right, the last piece of Power BI is mobile BI, so Power BI app. So right now, you have available to you in the Windows App Store right now, so if you're running Windows 8 on a tablet device or any device, you can actually connect to a Power BI site, a Power BI app that's inside the marketplace. So you can go download the Power BI app and use it on right now on Windows devices. I'll tell you this, they're very public about this. They're moving on to have that available on other devices as well in the future. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's actually part of the big push of making a lot of these visualization tools work in HTML5 so that they would actually be viewable on any device. Okay. All right, we'll talk a little bit about more of each of these here coming up next. But before we do that, I want to kind of give you a large landscape here of what you're doing with Power BI. So you have all of these tools available to you. Why are you using these, and what does an end-to-end project kind of look like? So as far as a self-service BI lifecycle, you're going through the steps of doing a data extraction. Okay, so I'm taking data out of some source. I'm merging or modeling that data, meaning basically creating relationships, creating hierarchies, creating calculations. That's really that data modeling step. And then finally, I'm visualizing that data in some way that my users can make sense of the data. Okay, so data extractions take that raw data out of a source, maybe apply some transformations to it. Data modeling is make sense of that data, create relationships, hierarchies, calculations, and then finally data presentation, make it viewable through a reporting layer of some kind. Now, if we have this kind of life cycle, this life cycle really applies for traditional BI projects as well. But if we have this kind of life cycle, let's translate how this life cycle applies to each of the tools we just talked about. Okay? So we talked about several different types of tools, one of them being Power Query and PowerPivot, actually two of them. PowerPivot and Power Query. Now, both of these tools allow you to do some form of data extraction. So if you have two tools that will be used for data extraction, why would you use one over another? Is usually the first question you get. All right, so let's talk about that. First of all, before I do that, let me just point out to you here that if you're using PowerPivot, you do have several different data sources available to you, some of which I'm listing out here. Power Query actually has some additional data sources available that you would not have inside PowerPivot. So there's one reason why you may choose Power Query is that it has more data sources available to you, and some of them I'm listing off here. I'm not going to read my slide for you. I think you can read it. But really the real reason why you would choose one over another, PowerPivot versus Power Query, is when you're extracting data from a source that needs transformations applied to it or needs business rules applied to it. Power Query has a transformation layer that's done through a query language called M, just the letter M. And these M queries or M transforms that you apply to the data allows you to do some minor data cleansing. So I can actually correct some of my data coming in and ensure that I have data that's appropriate to eventually visualize. Okay? PowerPivot is read-only. It's point it to a data source and bring it into a data model. So you can do data extractions with PowerPivot, but there's no real transformation layer to it other than you can apply some DAX column calculations and things like that. But really, that's not really transforming the data. It's more kind of creating new columns on top of others. Okay? So here's your choice. When I'm choosing PowerPivot, it's usually when my data is in good shape already. Okay? I'm happy with the state of my data. I'm pulling from more of a traditional data source. I would go with PowerPivot. So if I have a data warehouse, I'm trying to pull that into PowerPivot to merge multiple data sources together. I would start with PowerPivot for my data warehouse. Now, Power Query is if I have more unusual type of data source. For example, I'm trying to pull in from a big data source, like maybe HG Insight or Hortonworks, any of those Hadoop distributions. If I'm trying to pull in data from big data, from a big data source, I would be using Power Query. I may also want to pull data off of SharePoint lists or Active Directory, or you see Facebook here as well. I can use Power Query to give me the capabilities of doing that. So I can pull from more unusual data sources, and again, I can use that transformation language called M to be able to modify or cleanse that data before I bring it into my model. Okay? So Power Query, data needs to be fixed. Power Pivot, data is already in good shape. That's why you would choose one over another. Now, for the data modeling layer here, data modeling is all done through one tool, and that's PowerPivot again. Now, PowerPivot is going to give you the capabilities of doing things like this, where I can create relationships between multiple heterogeneous sources here. I'm pulling in multiple sources. Maybe I have on my Oracle system, I have in my HR data and my DB2 system, I have inventory, and on SQL Server, I have my time card entry, and I'm trying to pull all that data in together in one source. Now, clearly, you could do something like you would do in an enterprise system where you would create a full data warehouse and use SSIS to load it, but you could also use PowerPivot to create more of a self-service solution. Through a self-service solution like PowerPivot, I can bring these different data sources in, create relationships inside of Excel. They're logical relationships that live in Excel, and then I can create things like hierarchies on my data so I can make it easier for my users to navigate through my data sources. I can create calculations so my users have formulas that are already stored and created for them so they don't have to create those formulas on their own in Excel. And I can also do things like KPIs where I can identify for certain metrics, am I meeting my goal or not? So for example, if I have a profit KPI, I may say that I want to beat last year's profit. Okay? And if I beat last year's profit, then I met my goal, and I want to light up my key performance indicator as a green indicator, that sort of thing. So you oftentimes with KPIs have green, yellow, and red indicators whether or not you met your goal, and that capability is built into PowerPivot. Okay? So that's the data modeling layer, trying to make sense of the data, pull the different data sources together, and make it more usable for the end users. Finally, the last step here is data presentation. Now you have a lot of different ways you can present data, obviously. You have traditional Excel pivot tables and pivot charts. Those have been around for a while now. You also have PowerView, which is a newer tool for presenting data. And then also PowerMap. PowerMap we talked about just on the last 2 slides ago as well. So Excel gives you things like traditional Excel pivot tables, pivot charts, and there's also in Excel 2013 something new called Apps for Office. Now what Apps for Office allows you to do is go download visualizations that the third-party developers have created and Microsoft has vetted, and you can apply those visualizations on top of your data. And again, that's Excel 2013. It's called Apps for Office. Allows you to pull in some new visualizations. There's some really interesting ones in there, and there's also some kind of strange, wonky ones. So for example, I found one in there that would actually allow you to apply music to your data. I have no idea why you would do that, but it would actually allow you to put your data on top of this app that would actually play music for the values that you had inside the table. No idea why you would do that, but it's a visualization in there available. I guess it's not so much a visualization as it is an audio thing, but that is in there. There's some good ones in there as well. That's just one that's stuck in my mind. PowerView is also going to allow you to do things like tables and charts, but they're much more enhanced tables and charts. They're much more interactive. The charts you can actually interact with and experience the data a little bit more. You also have the capabilities of doing mapping inside PowerView. And then PowerView also has an option for exporting that's kind of interesting, where you can export a PowerView report to a PowerPoint slide deck. A lot of power words, but I intentionally said PowerPoint there. So I can take a PowerView report that I've developed, export it to a PowerPoint slide deck. So think of this, picture the scenario here. You want to make sure your executives have access to your reports. Usually what your executives do is they take screenshots of your reports and then they bring it to meetings. And this way what you can do is you can actually make it so that they bring reports in a PowerPoint slide deck and it stays connected to the live data. Now this functionality can only be done if you're using SharePoint, so you have to have SharePoint 2010 or higher. And you have to also deploy your PowerPivot workbooks to SharePoint to be able to do that. So basically the point I'm trying to make there is if you have just regular Excel 2013, the ability to export to PowerPoint is not there yet. It's only available when you're using SharePoint. But it's a really, really cool functionality because it allows you to still interact with your data while you're in a PowerPoint slide deck. And a lot of people find that very useful. The last one here, PowerMap, we've already mentioned, and I've talked about already a little bit, is a 3D mapping visualization tool. So it allows you to take geographical data and place that onto a 3D map. Okay. Now there's also some other components into here, of course. We talked about Power BI sites, Q&A. We'll take a look at those here coming up. All right. All right, so let's talk first thing about Power Query here. We're going to look at Power Query and what Power Query can do for us. And we've already talked about the why would we use it. Now I'm going to show you the how to use it. Okay. So again, what we're doing with Power Query is we're going out and we're discovering data. So maybe this is a data source that it would take a long time to get into our data warehouse, so we want to be able to still analyze that data very quickly. So we're going to use something like Power Query to bring it into Excel and make that analysis available to us. So really with Power Query what you're doing is you're going to discover that data source. You may actually combine it by merging multiple data sources together in Power Query. Okay? And then finally you'll refine it through that transformation layer steps that we talked about before. So I can apply transforms to my data, and when I do those transforms, it's done through the mQuery language I mentioned earlier. All right, so let's do our first demo here. I'm going to open up Excel 2013. By the way, you can do this one inside of Excel 2010 as well. Okay. I have some open there, but I want to open a new one. Let's do this. File, new. All right. All right, so I have a blank new Excel workbook here. I'm going to start from scratch and kind of walk you guys through how Power Query works. Now, Power Query is an add-in that you have to go and download. So if you do a search, a Bing search for Power Query download, you'll find it very quickly. One of the beautiful things about Power Query is it's updated very frequently. In fact, about once a month, you'll get a new update for Power Query changes. And usually what those updates consist of are things like adding new data sources to the availability of the tool, of course, bug fixes and any kind of new functionality they want to make available to you. Okay, that's all through Power Query. All right. Now, I'm going to go into my Power Query tab. You'll notice I've already have my Power Query tab available here. If you download it and install it, once you install it, you'll probably need to go enable the add-in that's done underneath the File and Options menu. I'm not going to show that right now, but that's just how you would enable it after you download it. Okay. All right, so underneath the Power Query tab here, you'll see I have several things available to me. And I'm going to kind of talk to the left-hand side here first, and we'll work our way through some of the other ones as well as we get going. But the first thing you'll see over here is the different types of data sources that you can pull in. I can pull in from an online search, from a web page, from files, from a database, and then from other sources has a bunch of options listed in there available to me. Online search is an interesting option. What that allows you to do is either search public data sources that are made available through the add-in. Okay, so there's actually a little search window that will pop open if I select that. And I can search out public data sources, or I can actually search out organizational data sources. Okay, so picture this. I work for a company that I do a lot of competitor analysis. I'm trying to analyze my competitors' data, and I've gotten this really nice Power Query extract where I've pulled in competitors' data, and it's given me a lot of benefit and helped me analyze my part of the company. But I'd like to make it so other people in my company can also use this really interesting competitor data set whenever they're doing their analysis. So what Power Query allows you to do is actually save a Power Query to your Power BI site, okay? And then when you save that query to the Power BI site, your other folks in your organization that you give access to look through these queries can then consume those queries and make that part of their solution as well. Now that sounds kind of scary. Here's one thing that often scares some folks off by this, is it sounds like anybody can deploy queries out there, and then I'd get this big log of a bunch of queries out there, and it will be really confusing because some people might deploy the same query more than once, and I don't want that mess to happen in my environment. Well, the good thing about how this works is there's actually a role inside the Power BI site called a data steward, and the data steward controls what is accepted and what is denied as far as queries. So they actually go and they vet the query, they make sure that the data is appropriate, and they make sure that it's not duplicating anything that's already on there. So that's kind of a role that they've added to the Power BI sites to make sure that there's a vetting process that happens when it comes to these queries that get deployed. Okay? So basically what happens with online search is you select online search here. Let me remove that. You select online search, and you'll see a little query window open here on the far right, which you can come in and do searches in here. So I can search something like busiest airports, and it would give me a list of all the busiest airports here. Okay? So this is actually bringing in public data sources, but I could connect this to my organizational data sets, or my organization's Power BI site, which is done up here. Okay? Let me close that. So up in the Power Query window here, if I connect to my organization here where it says sign in, I'll be able to search data sets inside my organization. Okay? It's actually pretty easy to configure. So that's online search. Allows me to search public data sets. The other option here, which I'm actually going to give you a demonstration of, is one here called From Web. And the way From Web works is if I select From Web, I can point it to a URL that I'd like to consume. And in my example here, I have a website here called Box Office Mojo. It has a bunch of really ratings or revenue for movies. And I can actually take this data from the web, just copy the web URL, bring that and paste it into my little box here and hit OK, and it will start to bring this information or bring this data into Power Query. So I'm actually taking data from the web, bringing it now into Excel, which you can see in this little navigator pane here in a moment, and it's essentially doing things like screen scraping here, where it's going to bring back all the data that I have on this particular page, bring it into Excel. And then I can do some data cleansing in this if I wanted to actually provide some certain things that I care about. For example, maybe I only care about certain columns. By the way, I've done some separate presentations on Power Query, so I'm just kind of talking as an overview on this one. But I could remove columns that I don't want. If I make a mistake, I can actually undo very easily in the bottom corner there. It's very easy to interact with this tool as far as a transformation layer. Okay? So I can tell it which columns I want to return back here, and then I can actually apply other transforms. Like you can see there's some funny characters on my year. If I wanted to fix that, I could right-click on here and tell it to replace values, and tell it I want to replace that little caret value that I see on the year with nothing, and you can see it will fix my years. It had a little caret next to each of my years, and I fixed that now. So it's really easy to interact with, and it's really easy to take what you've got here and push it into a visualization. I can go from nice report, nice data extract, to visualization very quickly. In fact, just briefly I'll show you this. I'll hit apply and close. You'll see that it brings the data from that extract into my query window here, and I can tell it I want to put a visualization on top of this. Okay. And then from this, by the way, there's more data than I have pulled in here. This just is a sampling of it. I could actually go across all the pages there if we had a little more time. But I can actually bring this into a visualization like PowerView, and I can tell it how do I want to visualize this and show it. I want to show this in something like a bar chart. Okay. And let's make this so that I don't want to have multiple verticals here, so I just want one chart. There we go. And I want to see something like this. So I'm seeing the total gross amount by studio by year. So I can actually look at each of the studios here. It looks like Warner Brothers had some great success here. Even in 2013, they've had some great success. I can highlight on top of each of these and actually look at them as well. So there's some sorting capabilities in here. There's a lot of functionality that I have available in here to me where I can actually do some sorting and find the information I care about most. Now, again, this is PowerView. The main focus here with Power Query was the actual data extract itself. So with the data extract, I went and I pulled data from a web, got it into an interface where I could actually visualize it. I could also do something else. I could send this data that I pulled from a website, and I can push it into PowerPivot. You'll notice in the bottom here, there's an option here called Load a Data Model, where I can actually send this data from the web page into my data model or into PowerPivot, and that way I can merge it with other data sets that I've already imported. Okay? So that's kind of what PowerPivot does. Power Query does. There are some other data sources that you can pull in from as well. There's a lot of other data sources available to you, but just for this little highlight of information here, that's all I'm going to show for this. Now, again, I have done some separate Power Query sessions for Pragmatic Works, so you can find those in past webinars if you want to see some specifics on how to do detailed Power Query stuff. All right, now, next tool that we're going to talk about here is PowerPivot. So PowerPivot, the beauty of PowerPivot is it takes a very difficult technology to learn, analysis services, and makes it very simple through Excel. So if you've ever tried to learn how to do multidimensional analysis services, it's probably the most difficult of all the BI tools to learn for most people. But it takes that difficult technology and makes it very simple inside of Excel. And again, it's been available inside of Excel as of 2010. So if you have Excel 2010, you can actually do all of what I'm about to show you here. Now, the benefit that you're getting by doing this in Excel is it uses an in-memory technology called xVelocity to actually make the performance of the data just as good as it would be in many cases as it would be on a server. Now, again, it's dependent on the resources of your laptop because it's using Excel, so depending on how much memory you have on your laptop, the more data you can handle and the faster it can handle it. It's also going to make a much shorter development lifecycle. So usually traditional multidimensional cubes take a very long time to develop, whereas PowerPivot does not take very much time at all to develop. It's also end-user capable, so what that means really is if you have a power user that understands the data that they're trying to pull in and they understand things like relationships, then they can be able to create their own PowerPivot models. Now, I would say it's more of a power user tool, not so much of a traditional end user that just knows how to view reports. It's going to be someone that understands data and relationships, so more of a power user. But it's all done through a familiar tool, Excel, so if they're familiar with Excel and they're familiar with Excel formulas, they'll pick up how to write things in DAX, the query language for PowerPivot, very quickly. Okay? So let's go ahead and look at our first demonstration here of PowerPivot. So what I'm going to show you here is how to create a data model, create relationships, and create hierarchies. All right, so I'm going to open up a new spreadsheet here, and I'm going to go this time to my PowerPivot tab. So this is a tab as well. And inside my PowerPivot tab, I'm going to tell it I want to manage a data model. Okay. Now, in my data model here, you'll notice that I actually have the movie data that we just looked at a moment ago got pushed into PowerPivot. And the reason that happened was because I created a PowerView report on top of it, and PowerView must be done through PowerPivot when you're in Excel. I'm going to remove this for our quick demonstration here just to make it a little less confusing and start with a blank design surface. All right, so I know that I want to pull in data from, could be a data warehouse, could be just a transactional system, whatever it is, I can pull in. I don't have to have a data warehouse to do PowerPivot. Okay. Now, in my case, I have a database. I'm actually going to pull from an Access database just to show you the flexibility this tool has. I'm going to pull in from an Access database that I have ready to go for this presentation, and it has in it all airline performance data. So it has in data here about how different airlines have performed as far as being on time or being late, that sort of thing. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in this airline performance access database, okay? And I'm going to tell it I want to pull in from a list of tables or views. I could also write a query here optionally, but I'm going to tell it to list tables or views. And I'm going to go ahead and bring back all of the tables that are available in this access database. I'll finally hit finish, and it's going to import this data now into PowerPivot. So it's taking data that I have in Access, bringing and importing it into PowerPivot, and from this point going forward, it's going to always refer back to the data that's in Excel and not in Access. Now, one thing that tells you is that means that my data is now static. So any data that I have in Excel is already old. If I get any new data that's put in my source database, then I'm not automatically bringing it into PowerPivot unless I go through the effort of actually hitting the refresh button to do a re-import of the data. Okay? So just keep that in mind as you do imports into PowerPivot. In this case, I'm actually importing about 2 million rows, so that tells you here that PowerPivot can handle much more as far as volume of data than traditional Excel can. Okay? So I got 2 million rows I just brought into Excel. Try and do that in your regular Excel interface. It'll blow up on you. But PowerPivot has the capability of doing that, and it's all because of the X-Velocity engine. Okay? Now again, this data, now that if I hit close, this data is going to be brought in here as separate tables. These are called PowerPivot tables that look like sheets. But this data is all static already. It's already old. If I get new data that's placed inside my data source, I would have to come under the refresh tab here to make sure I get it refreshed. Now there are ways to automate the refresh process, but it's done either through your Power BI site or through traditional SharePoint. We'll talk a little bit about that later. All right, now you have two views of the data inside PowerPivot. This is called the data view that we're looking at right now. You also have a diagram view that will show you more of a database diagram view of your data, which visualizes the relationships that you have. You can actually highlight on top of these lines that you see, and it will show you the relationships that you have between multiple tables. In my case, it automatically imported relationships I had just because my data source had relationships defined in it. Okay? If it did not have relationships defined, or if I did not have relationships at all, I could manually create those relationships just by dragging and dropping columns between them. Okay? Now, one neat thing that you get when you're using PowerPivot is the ability to create things called hierarchies. Now, you probably interacted with hierarchies before in the past. Hierarchies are just ways that help your users navigate through the data easily. So for example, if I wanted to create a hierarchy on this airport table that I have, I could expand it. There's a nice little maximize button here that maximizes it and takes up the full screen. And I can tell it that I want to create a hierarchy that has in it the country, the state, and the city. And then simply by right-clicking, I can tell it I want to create a hierarchy out of these three columns. So it actually created a hierarchy. I can call this my airport. I'll call it drill down. Maybe my users are more comfortable with the word drill down. And then I could even come in here and rename some of these columns. If I wanted to rename this one to be just state and just city, I can do that as well. This is all preparing the data so that your users will be able to interact with it and understand it easily. Okay? So that's a hierarchy. That makes it easier for them to create and navigate through the data. You also have the capability not only of doing hierarchies, but you can also create calculations. So for example, if there's a column that I want to add that does not already exist inside of my data model, I can add it using a DAX query. It's called a calculated column that you're doing it through. Now, calculated columns and DAX queries have to be done through the data view, so that's the first view of the data that we saw earlier. So I can hit the data view icon up in the top here, and it'll flip me back to the data view that we looked at earlier. Now, what I want to do is I want to add in a new column here on this on-time performance table that we're looking at, and what I'd like to do is make this calculation show me what the departure status is of each of these flights. Were they on time or were they late? So I see inside here I have a column, and that column is called departure delay in minutes. So I have a column in here called departure delay in minutes, and what I'd like to do is leverage this column to determine whether the flight was late or not. Now I see a bunch of zeros here, which tells me these flights weren't late, but as I scroll down, I'll start to see a couple values in here that actually show that the flights were late. So this flight was late by 2 minutes. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to create a new column in here, a calculated column, by right-clicking and inserting a new column. And this is called a calculated column, as you can see here. And I'm going to call this column, I'm going to right-click on it and rename it. I'll call this departure status. Okay. Now I'll use this column through I'll actually define this column through a DAX query. And my DAX query is actually done in the formula bar up at the top here, very similar to how it's done in Excel. But I'm going to tell it that I want to do a little if statement here, and I'll say if my departure delays, okay, so you can see the IntelliSense is pretty good here. If my departure delays are greater than 0, then let's define it as late, else it's on time. Okay. So I've just defined a new calculated column here. It looks like I got an extra comma in there. My mistake. Let's fix that. So that comma should actually be, there should be 0 there. If my departure delay is greater than or equal to 0, then it's late, otherwise it's on time. So this is going to create a new column here for me called departure delay with a bunch of lates and a bunch of on times if I go back up to the top here. Okay. All right, and actually I got my syntax backwards there. This first one should be greater than or equal to. It should be just greater than, excuse me. Make sure you note that. It can't be equal to 0 because that's everything. So I'm just going to say greater than 0. There we go. All right, now that I fixed that, I'm going to go create some calculated measures using DAX. Now, calculated measures, the purpose of those is to be able to calculate numeric data. So calculated columns are more creating new metadata for you to be able to drag and drop into pivot tables, whereas calculated measures are new aggregates that you may have. So some things that I might be interested in, I'm going to do some copying and pasting in here, is things like the number of flights that I've had, or how many flights I had that were on time versus how many were late. Now, calculated measures are defined differently. Calculated columns were defined up here in the table section, whereas measures are actually defined in this bottom section called a calculation area. Now, if I want to create a new calculation that tells me the number of flights that were on time, or let's just say the number of flights that I've had altogether, I could come up to my formula bar after selecting an empty cell here in the bottom, and I'll actually paste in a formula I've already created that's going to return back the number of flights, where I'm just simply doing a count of the rows that I have in here. So the number of flights that I have inside here is, looks like right at 2 million, and we saw 2 million whenever I imported the data earlier. I can do some formatting on this, so I'm going to format this as a whole number, so I can get a nice formatted value here. I'll give it some comma separators. There we go. And then I'm going to add in one extra calculation in here that's going to return back the number of flights that were on time. So I'll add in one more calculation, paste in this expression as well. The reason I'm doing that and pasting this in here is because I got a lot of other things I want to show you. But I'm going to paste this in here to see the number of flights that were on time. I'll make it a whole number and also give it comma separators, and that way we get some appropriately formatted data here. So I've gotten a data model, a very simple one, but I've gotten a data model. Now, if I want to visualize this data, I have a couple ways of doing so. I could do it through just traditional pivot tables if I want. So I could do something like this, come up to the top and tell it that I want to put this into a pivot table. Okay. I'll do it into a new sheet. It's fine. All right. And then in this new sheet, what I'd like to do is bring in something like this. Let's say we want to see the number of flights. So I'm going to go underneath my on-time performance table here. Okay. Underneath on-time performance, I'm going to bring in the number of flights and the number of on-time flights. I'll also bring in the year. So I have a year that's inside my date table here. I'll bring that in as well. Okay. Now, one thing you'll notice here is it's attempted to aggregate my year. I actually want to see year as a row grouping here. And then I'll also look at something like which country these are coming from. So I can know, depending on where this is at, I may have more delays in one country versus another. So I'm going to bring in country, and I'll bring that right underneath my calendar year to be able to visualize that here. So I can see here now each of the years by country and then the number of flights and the number of flights delayed. I could obviously do like a percentage on time if I wanted to. I can add some more calculations in here pretty easily. You also have the capability of doing things like this. If I wanted to see something like a nice little filter for the different airlines that I'm looking at, I could add something like a filter, but I can do it through a visualization called a slicer. Slicers have been around since Excel 2010, and what this allows me to do is it's a visual filter that I can actually select certain airlines, like Delta Airlines, and see how many flights Delta Airlines has had that were delayed or on time by country. Okay, that's just a visual filter. It's called a slicer. Now, new to 2013 is another type of visual filter. Again, this is only in 2013. This is what I'm about to show you, and it's called a timeline. And based on what you know about the name there, you can kind of infer that it's based on a date. So if I have an actual date value in here, which I apparently do not, but if I had a data type, I can actually create a timeline, and it makes for a nice little visual filter. And this is what it looks like right here. So this is a timeline up in the top right here. I can actually select certain years that I'd like to filter to, and then it applies that filter to my pivot table. Okay, it's called a timeline. It has to be based off of a date field first, so it looks like my display date must not be formatted as a date. Okay. All right, so that's what you can do kind of with traditional Excel. Let's go on to the next thing here that I want to show you. The next thing I want to show you is going to be PowerView. Now, what PowerView is again a ad hoc data visualization tool that allows you to create some very nice reports very quickly. And I'm going to, because of our interest of time here, I'm going to show you a completed example. It's all drag and drop. It's made very easy to do this, but basically what I've done here is I've created a nice little PowerView report, and I'm seeing here the percentage, or not the percentage, but the total flights that were on time versus the ones that were late. I could also see each of the states that had on-time and late flights, and I can click on individual ones if I wanted to. So if I click on Texas, I can see in 2010 for Texas, it actually affects the rest of my chart elements that I have here. So you can see it's all interactive. It all talks to each other. If I want to see just my late flights, I can click on late and see which one of my states has the most late flights. So there's kind of interesting things that you can do in here. I could also, you'll notice here that I have this cancellation reason. So if I want to see which ones were just canceled based on weather reasons, I can click on weather up here in my slicer. This is called a slicer as well inside PowerView, and it filters down the rest of my report items based on that. Okay. All right. So let me unfilter this. There's also some other capabilities. This one's called a scatter chart, and what the scatter chart is showing me is the different airlines across time and how many of them have had just by number of flights and on-time flights. It's showing me each of my airlines and their performance that they've had. So this is something that allows you to actually view data across time. And you can kind of scroll through this little scroll bar that I have here for the time element, and I can look at a certain point. So if I wanted to focus on a certain airline, say Delta Airlines, I can click on Delta and see how their performance was across time. That's all through PowerView. PowerView is a really powerful data visualization tool. Again, we do have some separate webinars on that if you're interested in that. All right, last one that I'm going to show here as far as different visualization tools is called PowerMap. And I'm going to open up a completed one for this as well because we're already running out of time here. We've had some good stuff, but it's gone fast. So what I'm going to show you in this one is actually based off, again, another webinar that I've done for Pragmatic Works, but it's a election data map. So I'm actually going to visualize election data, and what you'll see in this example that I've just opened is that underneath my insert tab, I have the ability to insert a Power Map tour. So I'm going to launch Power Map here. Oh, I need to go enable the feature. Let me go do that. Okay, there you go. It's enabled. And once it's enabled, I can actually launch either a new Power Map tour. A tour is basically kind of like a collection of different scenes that you've brought together, different focus areas of the map. Or I can go look at an existing one. So here's an existing one that I've already created. And this is going to launch open a separate Excel window for me, and it's going to visualize all of my election data. So this actually does look like an election map here because it is one. It has election data in here where I can actually look across time and show me all the elections across all presidential elections. You'll notice that there were no presidential elections on the West Coast in the 1800s here, so that's why there was visualized like that. I've also have multiple layers here. So not only do I have election results, but I also have these little heat maps that's on top of each of my different states. And what that heat map is visualizing is campaign contributions. If I want to be able to visualize and see campaign contributions by state, I've actually added that functionality in and I've applied it excuse me, as another layer to my map. So I can not only see election results, but I can also see campaign contributions all together on the same visualization. Now Power Map was just recently pushed out of beta, so it's no longer in beta. It's actually part of the general availability now. And as part of that general availability, it was announced that it would be only part of Office 365. So if you have an Office 365 account and you're using Office, then you will have Power Map available to you. The announcement was actually made that it will not be part of traditional Excel, so just be aware of that. They're kind of pushing people more towards the cloud version of Office. And there is some reasoning behind that, by the way. So the reason they're doing that is so that they can get and push out updates more frequently. So ideally, for me, I would like it to be available everywhere, but that's just how it is, how they made the announcement. All right, so this is Power Map. Now the output of what you do with Power Map, you can either just send this Excel file around to others, or you can actually create a video. So you'll notice up here in the top here that I can create a video that will show me different areas of the map. So I actually create multiple scenes that focus in on areas of the map that I want my users to see, and then I can output that as a video and then share that video really any way I want. I can share it through SharePoint, I can share it just by sending it to others, I can put it on a share drive. It's just up to you with how you share it at that point. All right. I know that was brief on PowerMap, but luckily PowerMap is actually pretty quick to show. All you would have to do is give it the visualization, the geographical type, the geographical field, which in my case was state, as you can see here. And then it maps out each of my state items, and I tell it what metric do I want to put on my state map. Okay. All right, the last thing I want to show you guys is the Power BI site, and I'll try and show you a little bit of the Power BI mobile app as well. We'll probably take this all the way to the end. Now, if you've asked questions, and I just pure run out of time to answer them all, I will let you know I do answer Q&A questions from webinars that I run out of time for on my blog. So my blog is devinknightsql.com, by the way. Okay. All right, now, the last piece here of what I want to show you is the Power BI site. Now, what I want to show you with here, this is a Power BI site that has some sample data sets on it, but I want to show you what we can do with our Power BI site as well. So if I wanted to, for example, add in a new PowerPivot workbook that we've developed, I can come down here to the document section and tell it I want to upload a file. I'll browse to the file and say I want to add in the election data that we just looked at a moment ago. Okay, so I want to add in the election data. I'll hit open. Ignore that error. That was from something else, actually. I'll hit OK, and it's going to upload that PowerPivot workbook that I developed into my Power BI site so that way it can be shared by others. Now, when you go to upload it into your site, you'll want to make sure that you go ahead and hit the little down arrow here to enable it. So I have to make sure I enable it for Power BI, and that's all I'm doing here. So it's actually enabling it. Now, once it's enabled, which should just take a moment or two here, I may have timed out because I haven't touched it in a while. There we go. Once it's enabled, you can actually see the Excel workbook. I can launch the Excel workbook, interact with it if I wanted to, all from inside of a web browser. So notice I'm in a web browser right here, but I still have the capability of doing filtering. I can filter down and look at particular election years if I wanted to. I have some quite a bit of capabilities here, all through a web browser in Excel. This is called Excel Services here. That's not the piece I want to show you, though. That's not new. That's not really, that's a small portion of Power BI. The piece I want to show you is Power BI Q&A. Now, how Q&A works is I need to provide the PowerPivot workbook and tell it that I want to enable it for Q&A. So I'll hit the little ellipses here, tell it that I want to add it to Q&A. You'll also notice that you can enable data refreshes here. So if I want to automate the process of refreshing my data, I can do schedule data refresh. But for this example, I'm going to tell it that I want to add to Q&A. So it's enabled it for Q&A. And once I've enabled it for Q&A, I can come up to the top here and tell it that I want to do a Q&A search. And this will actually allow me to ask my data questions. This is that functionality I mentioned where you can just type in questions and it returns back data. All right, so if I wanted to ask a question of my election data, I could tell it that I want to see votes by party. Okay? So I ask it an English question. I say, show me votes by party. Or let's say votes with an S. I'll say, give me votes by party, and it'll actually show me here a visualization of Democratic and Republican parties and the number of votes that they've had. Well, I like that, but let's also look at something like votes by state. Now, if I type in votes by state, it'll actually appear on a map because it knows that I've asked it for a geographical data field. So it's actually showing me votes by state. I can hover on top of these, and it'll actually show me the number of votes by state as well. I could also ask it things like votes by year, and it will bring this to me back in a, let me do votes by year, votes with an S. It'll bring me back this as a column chart, but I could easily change this from a column chart to a line chart if I wanted to and visualize this data across time as a trend line. So a lot of neat functionalities you have available here to you. Now you can also do something like this. If you want to interrogate your data just by asking it questions, that's a really cool functionality. But you can also create something called featured questions. So if I wanted to create a featured question, I would actually expand this section on the far right here and tell it that I want to create a featured question. Tell it what my question is, something like votes by party. You can tell it that it's going to create a tile for you, kind of a preset tile. You can see a preview of it over here. And you could also change the color of that tile if you wanted to and provide a different image here if you wanted to as well. You could also, on the bottom, if you didn't want to use one of the default images they provided, you can actually create your own background image like I have attempted to do here. Oh, there we go. There we go. So I brought in a picture of Abraham Lincoln that's going to show me votes by party, and if I hit save, it's going to save that as a featured question. And what happens now is if I go back to the Q&A homepage, went a little bit too far there, Q&A, I'll now see my question, my featured question I created here, votes by party, appear as an icon. My users can just click on that featured question, and it returns back data. Okay? And we can do this as many times as we want. I can go back in here and do votes by state. Let's do one more. I'll add a featured question, votes by state. I do have an image for this one as well. Okay. All right, and I can see this one's going to show me an election map here. So I can hit save on this one, go back to my Power BI site, my Q&A site, and I'll see the featured question in here for votes by state. Now the neat thing about how this works is I can actually ask it different types of questions. So we just saw votes by state, and what votes by state brought back was data from my election results workbook. Okay, but if I ask it something like number of medals by country, check this out. It changed the workbook that it was querying, and instead of querying the election data, it started querying the Olympics workbook that I have in here, the sample workbook that came with the Power BI site. So it actually reads into the question and determines which one of the data sets it should pull back from. Okay, and so there's some really neat things going on here. The other thing that's worth noting here is that inside your actual PowerPivot workbook, you're going to enable something called synonyms that will walk you through and actually help you create a more effective workbook. Now I'm going to do a webinar next month that's specifically on this feature. So we don't have any webinars on our past webinars yet on Q&A, but in April we're actually going to do a week of Power BI, and in that week of Power BI, one of the sessions I'll be doing is going to be on Q&A, and I'll go much more into the details of how this works, how you set it up and configure it so that you get the results you would anticipate. All right, so we've shown Q&A. The last thing I want to show you guys before we wrap up, we got a little bit less than 10 minutes left. The last thing I want to show you guys is mobile BI. Okay, so I just showed you, I'll bring back my slides open for a moment. I just showed you how the Power BI sites work. Now let's look, and we just showed Q&A as well, so we already looked at how that works. Now let's actually go and look at, skip over some of these slides, we already did this. Let's look at the mobile BI. How does mobile BI work now with Microsoft and Power BI? So I'm running Windows 8 here on my machine. So this is capable on my machine already. I'll go to my desktop here, my Windows view, my tile view, and I'll type in Power BI. Now this is going to launch my Power BI app, and inside my Power BI app I connect it to my Power BI site, and I'll be able to see inside my Power BI site all of the workbooks that we've deployed. Okay, so you can see several of them in here. There's one in here for shark attacks. There's one in here for car sales. There's a lot of different versions of these workbooks in here. So if I selected one like car sales, for example, what this would show me is it will actually bring up any kind of either PowerView reports, or it may actually bring up, oh, it didn't make me authenticate before. Let me cancel that. Let me pick a different one. The one I chose before didn't make me authenticate. Let me pick this Olympics one. There we go. So I'll choose the Olympics one here. This will work just fine. And what this is going to show me is my Power BI site data through a mobile application. Okay, so I can get to my BI data from a mobile app. I can interact with it, so I can select and change the different slicer that I have here. I can change and select on different features that I have that's part of my report, and they all interact just like they would from inside of PowerView. So all that functionality still lives and still works inside this report. I can also go between multiple pages of reports. If I have another report page I want to go to, I can flip back and forth between the different pages that are available to me. So in this case, this is a report that says medal distribution by country. I can see each of those medal distributions. I can change the country to North America, for example, and see that in here as well. All that functionality still works from a mobile device. Again, you can go to any one of your applications or any one of your reports that you've developed, including this one here. This is one of the scatter charts, and they all work from inside of the Power BI app. So very, very cool functionality you have in here. All right, so that's the mobile app. Mobile app, again, it's just in the Windows Store. You search for Power BI, you'll find the mobile app that is available to you. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about with you just briefly, I'm not by no means a salesperson, but I wanted to point out to you how Office 365 works with Power BI. So that Power BI site that I showed, the Q&A functionality, all that is available to you, but you have to have the Power BI subscription with Office 365. Now, you can certainly do things like Power Query, Power Pivot without having Office 365. You just have to have a Excel that's 2010 or higher. So you don't have to have Power BI for some of these features, but to get the grand suite of things that I just showed you today, you have to have the Power BI subscription. Now, Microsoft actually released the pricing for this very recently. By no means am I a Microsoft sales rep, but I wanted to at least show you that information. What you're seeing here is whether or not you have Office 365 already, what your pricing would be. So for us, for my company, I already have Office 365. So if I wanted to add on the Power BI capabilities, it would be $20 a month per user per month. Okay, so $20 per user per month. Now, if I do not already have Office 365 and I want to be able to have the capabilities of what we've seen today, I would be looking at this guy here on the far right, which has both Office 365 Pro Plus as well as a standalone Power BI functionalities. Now, what this does, keep in mind, this is more than a traditional BI decision. This is more of a how my company does Office installations that from here on out. So rather than actually having a media file that they have to install Office for, there's actually a web installer that you have now with Office 365. So it's a pretty big decision. It's something that if your BI group is looking at doing, you would actually bring in other portions of your company, your administration that deal with licensing and things like that, and say, hey, we're looking at going to more of the subscription model for Office because it's going to constantly keep us up to date. We won't be behind on Office by 2 versions every year. I know a lot of companies I've done consulting in the past, and a lot of companies I walk into, they're at least 2 versions of Office behind. So the last company I was at, they were running Office 2007. So they weren't getting any of the benefits of Power BI or any of the benefits of even just PowerPivot. So having Power BI and really Office 365 makes it so it's much easier to keep up to date, and you get all that new functionality. Okay, now we are, I'd love to take, maybe we can do 1 or 2 questions here, Rachel. That's all I have as far as content for today.
Sure. We have a bunch of questions, so I'll send you the full report, and like Devin said, he'll follow up via blog post to any of the ones we don't get to. One of the questions that a couple people have asked is what devices are currently supported by mobile BI?
Oh yeah, so mobile BI devices they have to be a Windows device at this point. They are going to be expanding to Apple devices in the future. It's just not there yet. That is one of their major priorities as far as the mobile team that's working is to get it into mobile devices like Apple. Mainly because if you walk around, you'll see most executives are probably using an Apple device, and Microsoft's not dim there. They realize that's the case, and they're going to make sure that the mobile BI apps will work on Apple devices. It's just not there yet, but it will be.
Okay.
Now, let me follow up on that.
Yeah, sure.
Part of the reason that does not work right now, by the way, is because a lot of the visualizations that you see are using Silverlight, and Silverlight's kind of like Microsoft version of Flash, and unfortunately, Silverlight does not work on Apple devices. Silverlight is being replaced by HTML5, which works on any device. So you'll actually see as they finish the migration from Silverlight to HTML5 that all of that functionality will work on Apple devices as well.
Awesome. All right. Our next question is, can the reports in the Power BI suite be edited in Excel by a user to do a custom workbook?
They could potentially, yeah. So if you deployed a workbook off to Power BI, as long as you give them permission, they could potentially download the workbook. So again, it's a permission thing. But if they have permission to download the workbook, then they can kind of edit it and make it their own and save it locally and do what they want with it. So absolutely.
Okay, awesome. I think we only have time for 1 more question, so I'll just grab one from the queue. Can you explain quickly how to use PowerView in SharePoint 2010? Is that more of we have a couple sessions on that actually that would probably be pretty good.
Yeah, we do. I can briefly talk to it though. So if you have SharePoint 2010 Enterprise, so I got to make sure I emphasize it does have to be Enterprise, and so you need SharePoint 2010 Enterprise and SQL Server 2012, either Enterprise or BI Edition. Okay, so SharePoint 2010 and SQL Server 2012, both of those together. That will allow you to take PowerPivot workbooks that you've developed, they could even be Excel 2010 workbooks, deploy those to SharePoint, And then from inside of SharePoint, it actually has the functionality to create PowerView reports in the web. So you don't have to have Excel, you don't have to download anything extra, you actually stay within inside of a web browser and create reports directly there. So there is a little bit of setup. Again, the setup that you need is SharePoint 2010 Server, and Service Pack 1, I should mention. So SharePoint 2010 Service Pack 1, Enterprise, and SQL Server 2012, either Enterprise or BI editions. And those two things together will allow you and give you the capability of creating PowerView reports in SharePoint 2010.